In Christianity, envy is the worst of sins. This is since all the others at least have some value to the world besides being sins themselves. Although pride is a sin, some of the greatest acts of heroism of all time were built off pride or the desire to not let one's status be thrown into the dirt. Lust is how babies are made and the world goes round. However, envy has no positive aim whatsoever. For those that don't know, envy is the desire to tear down what others have. Not for any gain of yours, really, that's more jealousy. If your best friend is dating a really attractive, wonderful in every way girl and you want her, that's jealousy. If you want both of them to suffer at no gain to yourself since they have happiness that you can't experience, that's envy. Envy is an ugly emotion that ennobles no one, and because of it, we've tried to hide it. However, it's still powerful, and as we'll talk about in this video, has driven much of history and human society in ways few other things have. As we'll also see, it's powering the world of today in ways few other things are. If the Victorians were terrified to talk about sex, we're terrified to talk about envy. When you see how envy controls the modern world, you'll be horrified. But first, we need to see why envy exists and how we got where we are. The Western Christian world grew out of the crumbling Roman Empire, and we've envied the unity and dominance of Rome ever since. Now you can enjoy the glory of Rome with a great series on Magellan TV called I, Caesar: Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. This awesome series details the lives of the greatest Roman emperors from Julius Caesar and Augustus to Constantine and Justinian, showing the full power, glory, decadence, and decay of Rome. See the rise and fall of one of the greatest civilizations of all time in real time. I watched this all on Magellan TV, a streaming platform made by filmmakers that has the richest history content of anywhere. Even if that's not your thing, Magellan has over 3,000 documentaries and dramas and a wide variety of topics from current events to tech and science. You can watch Magellan TV in 4K and in almost every device. Whatever it is you're looking for, Magellan TV's got something for you. Today, Magellan's offering a 1-month free trial for anyone who uses the link in the description. Whatever your interests are, Magellan TV's got something for you, so click the link, get your free trial, and start learning today. One of the problems of the modern Western world is that we take things working for granted since we never get to see what the world's like when those things aren't working. Few of us have ever had to worry about dying of malaria or ending up in an arranged marriage we hate. In the same way that technology has made our lives so much easier, so has social evolution. Over time, our societies have evolved towards greater and greater efficiency and less immorality and cruelty. For example, just look at how the Bronze Age governments would literally brag about how many of their opponents they butchered and how many of their own people they sacrificed to honor the deaths of their kings. However, over a multi-thousand-year period, those kinds of governments were continually outcompeted by kinder regimes that could pull on their population's loyalties. Similarly, how a person's life used to be dominated by countless superstitions and taboos that made life significantly harder than today by trying to pay attention to all of them. We don't seem to put together that in the same way we have to maintain the technological systems that hold up our modern society, like bridges, agricultural systems, and the like to keep them functioning, our social norms are the same. Without struggle and effort, human societies degrade back to base, disgusting norms. One of those norms is envy, which is extremely powerful across human history, but we've been able to control for centuries with social constructs that mean we can afford to forget how far we've stretched from the normal human condition. Let's start with where humans naturally evolved as hunter-gatherers. Among hunter-gatherer peoples, things are normally shared in the same way things are in a family or a group of friends. Since people were almost always in the move looking for food and resources, people didn't have a lot of possessions. However, that didn't mean these societies were equal. There were large inequities in the amount of sex people had, with 20 to 40% of the male population dying in war and youth, with the chieftain normally having half the women. This world was in a lot of ways zero-sum, unlike modern capitalism, and so envy evolved as a group hedge against single people doing outrageous stuff like accumulating all the seal meat in your lodge during a famine and charging your buddies for it. The group dare implicit in envy is something like, we'll burn your whole lodge including the seal meat down, so don't even think about trying it. Hunter-gatherer societies cared a lot about equality and not letting tyrant alpha males seize power. An example is among the Bushmen of South Africa who, when a young man would make a great kill, will actively tell the young men they're worthless and low value so as not to let their egos get too big. Hunter-gatherer peoples will mock and socially outcast alpha males who try to seize total power over the tribe, finally killing them as a group. Something that always confused me in my personal life was why people were so scared of social pressure. I'm a person who's naturally wired to not care a lot about what others think about me, and I always found it confusing why in high school, for instance, trying hard at things and being earnest was looked down upon while it actually produced amazing results. Similarly, why people are so scared to try things that might fail, even if it costs them nothing but wasted effort and emotion, like starting a business or side hustle, romantically reaching out to a potential partner, or starting a new hobby. This is because our minds are designed for hunter-gatherer communities of a couple dozen or so rather than millions of people. The people that survived were those that got along among the small group of people that they'd have to share their lives with. Someone like me would probably have been murdered by the rest of the tribe for showing why some tribal superstition was, from my perspective, clearly false. Most humans are naturally conditioned to get along and undershoot their potential, since without the size of social hierarchies as they are now, there is simply less to gain from extreme risk-taking. From a genetic basis, the people who make up our current political, CEO, and leadership classes in general are insane genetic outliers that are wired to expend massive amounts of effort to succeed by basically gambling being disliked with massive success. In a hunter-gatherer community, the most success you could have is making a big bison kill. At the same time, not getting along with the group of people you would live with for your entire life would be very dangerous. An interesting story here comes from Haiti, where if a person's walking along and sees their neighbor working in the field, they might ask, "What are you doing?" to which the reply would be, "Hardly working." This is since the neighbor saying working hard would suggest that they were judging the other person for not working. This is the norm across most cultures. Take the Navajo, who believe that if a person's happy and lives a good life, he must have taken that from the net happiness in the world, and so might be a wizard that's stealing good fortune from his neighbors. Alternatively, take the East Asian saying the tallest blade of grass gets cut down first, which basically tells people to not show too much initiative and differentiation from the group. The veritable superstitious cult of the evil eye that traditionally existed across Asia and the Mediterranean is a great example of envy. In places like Italy, India, or Egypt, people desperately try to avoid getting the evil eye, or the envious curse of their neighbors that would bring ills upon them. This is because these are societies that haven't really had the rule of law develop, with arbitrary, often cruel authorities. This means that pleasing and not offending people, whether your compatriots in the same social class that you have to live with, or your social superiors that you're dependent upon, is really important, since there's no system of fair courts and government if things go wrong. The best way to not get killed as a witch was not to offend people in your local community enough that they'd make up evidence against you that you are a witch. Another great example is that if you look at architecture across Asia, you often see even the wealthy live with very plain outsides, and all their wealth only visible on the inside of their house. In cultures like this, directly bragging about success is viewed as extremely crass. One of the things that's confused me across history is how stiflingly collectivist most of history's been. With the exception of the West for the last 1500 years, people in even very advanced societies like the Middle East, China, or India lived in clans with very little freedom. The top example of this is the caste system in India, which effectively ground the individual down with controlling every aspect of their lives between mate, occupation, and minor taboos they'd follow, which include how they live, dress, cook, allowing very little space for innovation. India is especially high in controlling the individual, but other societies have manifested similar systems. These extremely controlling collectivist societies are the norm since they mitigate envy and individual responsibility. If your arranged marriage sucks, that's your parents' problem, not yours, and you can keep telling yourself that. Most of human cultural history has been the attempt to shift blame away from the individual. When a person's life is controlled by countless little taboos and regulations, it means they can't succeed and so make everyone else feel bad. Another example of envy protection is the success of monarchies. The reason monarchies were so ubiquitous in the pre-modern world was that they were effective. Of all other forms of government, whether republics, theocracies, or military juntas, they all devolved into monarchies eventually. There have been eras of history centuries long in which almost every state in the world was a monarchy. Monarchies were so effective since they were able to displace envy, and that once people agreed in a leader that was chosen in many ways randomly, people could feel equally unfair about them not being king. A major problem in societies without hereditary monarchies like the Roman Empire or early Anglo-Saxon England was civil wars, as people were continually fighting on becoming the ruler. Thus, stable societies deviated towards being hereditary monarchies. A very common manifestation of this is hatred of merchants and commerce. Merchants are one of the very few social classes that can have their successes be directly measured, and thus have the potential to get things really, really right and make unimaginable amounts of money. A free market is a representation of ultimate reality, and they are getting people things that they really want or need in the real world, and accruing benefit from it rather than purely pleasing emotions and whims. This means that the potential for gain if you get things right is extraordinary. The financial benefits accrued to the successful in capitalism has been unimaginably painful to people's senses of envy. This has been solved in some societies by demonizing hard work, whether in Haiti as shown before, or with crushing the merchant classes, which has been the norm across history. This norm was for the ruling classes to regulate merchants into weakness or to create monopolies in order to weaken the free market. In the Roman Empire, this process of killing the merchant classes was done by the army. In the Islamic and Indian world, it was a combination of the priest and warrior classes, and in China, it was a centralized bureaucratic state. In the Middle Ages, the Middle East was the richest place in the world, but over the late Middle Ages, arbitrary business regulations transformed it into one of the poorest. China nearly had an industrial revolution in the 11th century when they were producing more total steel than early 19th century Britain, but didn't due to government overregulation that made it uneconomical to run those foundries. The fact that this sort of thing made everyone involved poorer doesn't matter to envy. A perfect example of this sort of thing has been the treatment of middlemen and merchant minorities like the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Indians in East Africa, and the Jews in Europe and the Middle East, all of which who made their total societies far wealthier. These groups normally came into the regions with nothing except the clothes on their back, but due to human capital or elements in their culture that made them more competitive against the native population, like hard work, knowledge of the market, or developed skill sets, allowed them to become wealthier than the local community. However, they've continually faced discrimination time and time again due to envy. Again, stuff like evicting the Jews from Spain or the Indians from Uganda, or the economic repressions against the Chinese in Malaysia and Indonesia have made everyone involved poorer, but that doesn't matter to envy. Aristocracies and the ruling classes across history, even when they've ruled completely incompetently, have normally been able to shift the blame to the merchant classes and use them as a scapegoat to the population. This is because the aristocracies have normally been inaccessible to the general population, and so you aren't judged negatively for not being able to become an aristocrat, since no one can. However, for the merchant classes, where generally everyone can become a wealthy shoe salesman, there's a greater degree of envy and feeling that you didn't measure up. My historic speciality is the Middle Ages, and I always find it depressing that it's an era of history that people treat like it's some dark age backwater, but in reality it's some of the very most important innovations that allowed the modern world to develop. There were a series of shifts that took place in Europe in the early Middle Ages that all clumped together and called the Western Revolution, which largely created the cultural bases that modern Westerners take for granted. This revolution allowed for controls and envy that created the conditions for the modern, technologically developed world to develop. The first part of which was that the Catholic Church banned cousin marriage, which meant that clans couldn't hold together. Beforehand, you were married off to your third cousin to keep your clan intact, but when that was no longer possible, people started to live in nuclear families and started being judged as individuals rather than members of collectives. Another large factor was that Europe never developed large empires like Asia did, meaning that there were lots of political competition and conflict in the Catholic Church and local state authorities, which created the separation of church and state. This all resulted in lots of social competition between different groups like the merchants, nobility, monarchy, etc. Freedom should be viewed kind of like a market system, in which we've historically had about as much freedom as we've been able to claw from our governments, whether in the form of nasty geographies, armed populations, or strong societies capable of resisting tyranny. In Europe, the conditions of competition, on both the social and political level, meant that people had more choice than ever before. If you didn't like your family, you could move to a city. If you didn't like your lord, you could work for another one for better terms. Europe went through a series of social shifts that shifted it towards individuality. One's moral worth was based upon their personal relationship with God. In places like England and northern France, arranged marriages for normal people went away in the 11th century. While centralized empires crushed parliaments around most of the world, they flourished in almost every country in medieval Europe. Capitalism was able to thrive since Europe's merchants started out as pirates independent from the government, and so were negotiated into the government system rather than merely being subsidiaries to it. Another important factor is the West is part of the 12% of societies that have been monogamous across history. Most societies across history are polygamous, and studies have found polygamy is a great causer of political violence. As the more young women there are than men who are married off to rich men, that means there are more single young men who will cause crimes and violence until their genetic fate is stable. An effect of having monogamy in the West was that it created more gender equality since it created more negotiating power for upper-class women since they had a monopoly on reproduction. I think a really telling example of this shift was that in the late Middle Ages, European artists started to sign their paintings to show pride in their work. This was opposed to Asia, where one was meant to make the perfect version of a pre-existing artistic trend, and the artists themselves were unimportant and unknown. However, this sign of individuality meant European artists were incentivized to try new things in order to get more fame for their name. This is why the West went through such a massive artistic evolution after the Renaissance, while Asian civilization stayed largely the same. The structure of Christianity also allowed a good deal of controlling envy in that it believed in objective truth that existed in the real world above what was written in texts by pre-existing social superiors. Similarly, its main insistence was upon a loving God which would forgive mistakes. The idea of heaven also created the afterlife, which people could hold on to if their current lives sucked. It meant that if you were an economic failure but a good person, good things would still come to you. These three things allowed control of human emotions like envy to a greater degree since it held an abstract that individuals could hold onto beyond their community's whims. This Western revolution allowed the Western world to have the scientific and technological revolutions. Other civilizations were able to make massive technological advances like China's invention of gunpowder, the printing press, paper, and compass, but never used them, or had developed market economies which were regulated out of existence. The West, since it suppressed envy, was able to have massive successes. The West was able to suppress envy for the longest time, and with it came the massive technological, artistic, and social gains that went to that civilization. But, without noticing, the underlying structures that held down envy were weakening, thus provoking tens of millions of deaths in the 20th century, driven almost entirely off envy. The decline in traditional religions precipitated the rise in envy. It's interesting to see the word envy as a percentage of total words used precipitously decline from the 19th to 20th centuries. To chalk something up to envy was something acceptable in discourse a century ago, but now such things would be called victim blaming. You can clearly see that with the decline of Christianity in the Western world, socialism has risen. The countries that have remained the most Christian, like the United States and Poland, have largely remained the most capitalist, while the secular have become more socialist. The thing is that although European socialism has allowed a comfortable standard of living for the people with work, it's overall made Europe a lot poorer. In that Europe is the main part of the world that's seen active economic decline, with Europe going from 38% of the world's economy to 24% since the 1960s. Much of Europe has seen double-digit unemployment, and Europe also sent its creative and entrepreneurial class to the US. Silicon Valley was heavily built off European expats, for example. It seems like the European post-World War II compromise has largely been that they'd prefer to have a comfortable standard of living for most, and regulate the system so much that those that want to push beyond and build go to America or the City of London. This is a system that makes most of Europe weaker in real time. Similarly, studies found that lots of the post-World War II tax rates in the wealthy, like the 90% one in the US and the 95% in Britain and Sweden, had no economic justification. Although high taxes on the wealthy make a lot of sense under certain circumstances, when you're getting to that level, the economic validity makes no more sense, and the only possible one is envy. An important thing to understand is that intellectuals as a group are inherently envious. This is since they're normally very smart, but often lack the drive, grit, or courage to become wealthy or powerful. But since they're smart, they think they could do those things better than the people who get them. They get really angry when people who they view as intellectually inferior, like businessmen or politicians, get wealthy and powerful while they don't. An example of this inside academia is that popular writers or people who write for the public are looked down upon as low class, but in reality, popular writers serve a very valuable role of bringing these teachings out of the obscure halls of academia into the real world. However, a lot of this probably comes from envy in that these writers are wealthier and more famous than professors. And this is basically the only way communism makes sense. For labor unions, I get communism, since it's abstractly just an extension of their power, but for intellectuals, communism is a way that they can believe they can get total power over society and use their planning abilities to fix the world while removing all the people like businessmen and politicians. Communism as it exists today doesn't make sense with any other prism except envy. It's been routinely shown to make people poorer and has failed at every single attempt on every continent and every civilization. If we were using the scientific method for the costs incurred, communism has clearly been a failed experiment. However, the fact that the intellectual world continues to be overwhelmingly leftist suggests there's ulterior motives. Just look at the Soviet Union in the 1920s, which briefly allowed private farming and business, and then had a large economic upswing and plenty of food. but then crushed that local initiative for communal work which would control envy, thus driving the country into poverty, recession, and famine. This meant that the envy was more important to them than helping the poor. Similarly, almost every communist regime ever resulted in an immediate absolute decline in the standard of living for decades afterwards. When we see how communist regimes have acted across history, the only motivator that makes sense is envy. Look at the purging of the kulaks in the Soviet Union, or the more prosperous peasants. People who normally only had slightly larger homes and a few more cows than their neighbors. However, all the Russian peasants were equally poor only a few decades before, and so if you hadn't risen up in the 1920s, it was largely your fault as an individual, which drove envy through the roof. Killing the kulaks, or literally the hardest working and most productive people, created massive famines and economic wastage. The Soviets would rather starve than deal with their own personal senses of envy. You can look at similar conditions in China, where the landlord class as a rule wasn't that rich, and the country as a whole didn't have a lot of inequality, but the landlords were brutally humiliated, killed, and dejected. And just like in Russia, the process of land centralization resulted in millions of deaths and killing what was already a functioning agricultural system, causing one of the worst atrocities in history with over 30 million deaths. On an international basis, we see this with third world leftism, in that third world countries would routinely expel foreign populations or experts that were actively helping their economies, like the French in Côte d'Ivoire or the Indians in Uganda, making both countries significantly poorer. Alternatively, look at how countries like Venezuela and Cuba will put themselves into poverty and Russian influence in order to escape corporate influence that's objectively making their countries wealthier. A perfect example of envy coming from the right is the Nazis. The German Jews were significantly wealthier than non-Jewish Germans and were instrumental in the formation of a bunch of key industries. German Jews were assimilating, German-speaking, and were often deeply patriotic. However, this only made the envy worse and the German desire to kill them greater. The Holocaust is another example of envy's powerful force. Okay, I'm going to make a controversial claim, but you need to stick with me. The underlying basis of social justice philosophy is envy. I'll give two examples. The first of which is the fat body positive movement. This basically shames society for saying thin, fit girls are beautiful and fat girls aren't. However, objectively, thin people are healthier than fat people in real terms, which the modern left says is fat shaming to say. I know modern society pushes unhealthy body expectations, but going the other direction is more ridiculous. Similarly, standards of beauty, although they fluctuate a bit, are still tied to evolutionary biology. If you get an Indian, Chinese, or German guy in a room together and have them rate women on their beauty, they'd line up quite a bit. Similarly, paintings of beautiful women and art from previous eras still hold up today. There's a real market value for beauty that's objective. The only possible answer is that ugly girls are enviously trying to tear down the real advantages beautiful women have, which they either got to genetic luck, working out, or putting themselves together well. Another example is BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. The term people of color to describe all non-white people was weakened by Asians and Hispanics' greater wealth and assimilation into American society, and thus the term was shortened to Black, Indigenous, People of Color. The thing we forget here is that Asians in a lot of ways faced legal discrimination as bad, if not worse, than black people in the 20th century. However, due to advantages in cultural capital, Asians and Hispanics have done better than blacks and indigenous people. Although discrimination surely is a factor, you can't mark all inequities up to it. Just look at how different subgroups of black people have wildly fluctuating incomes. African Americans of West Indian immigrant ancestry are significantly wealthier than those of native black ancestry. Alternatively, black people whose ancestors were free before the Civil War have consistently been 50 years ahead of black people who had slave ancestors in stuff like education, money, and the like. With the term BIPOC, the fact is that we aren't celebrating the success of the Asian and Hispanic community, but instead focusing just on the continued oppression of the black and indigenous, which precludes any explanation except envy. If you look at social justice, it exists to tear down any inequity, whether that between men and women, different ethnic groups, fat and thin, rich and poor, successful and unsuccessful nations around the world, saying all of it must be driven by oppression. It ignores that every single category of anything across history and geography is naturally deeply unequal. Similarly, it views success as zero-sum in that the oppressors must stop oppressing, rather than the unsuccessful should find things to emulate in the successful. This is the dictionary definition of an envious viewpoint. An interesting phenomenon in social justice has been that it's primarily driven by upper middle class people, which has a lot of reasons behind it, but one of which is that our brains are still wired towards the scale of a tribal hunter-gatherer band. Thus, if you were too successful, you would worry that someone else would try to take it from you. Convoluted as it sounds, when wealthy children preach socialism, they subconsciously worry that their unearned privilege will make them targets for social recrimination, and thus want to start that process itself so it won't devour them. This is the only way that it makes sense to me. Also, look at streetwear in general fashion, in which people try to dress like they're poor in order to not provoke others' envy, while also wearing expensive versions of poor people's clothing to still show that they're high value. Similarly, look at the culture of chilling, in which people like to say they are into vibing, chilling, smoking weed, and watching Netflix, which I guess is fun for some people, but isn't something you should be bragging about in a healthy society. Youth culture today is literally about being an antisocial, sociopathic degenerate. Again, this is similar to the old Haitian story we talked about before of trying to show you're not trying to be better than someone else by working harder or trying to be more successful than them. We should also view the hatred of historical figures as an envy for the past. In real objective terms, what has our generation accomplished in comparison to our forefathers? They won the world wars, ended disease and real grinding poverty, reached the moon, ended slavery, did actual legal changes to deal with discrimination, tamed thousands of miles of wilderness and beat tyrannies. When we tear down the statues of figures like Churchill, write histories without dead white males, or cut Shakespeare out of the curriculum, we enviously destroy their memories so that we don't have to think about them and how we don't hold up. The internet really pushes this process that it allows people to show the worst parts of their personalities without recrimination. I find it depressing you see really brutal and mean comments to people posting online trying to improve themselves. Similarly, how often interesting ideas online just get circle-jerked and hated without actual addressing of their validity. Places like Reddit and 4chan deride everything because they don't have to hold themselves to any standards. To cancel a famous person is to tear down a successful person that you could be judged against. There are two ways to answer this, in both the broad social level and the individual. On the social one, we should try to copy what the West has done. Martin Luther King's message of judging people as individuals for their moral value rather than judging them for their group identity like the rich, the Jews, etc. is the way forward. We need to have the Christian message that all people, even if they've done evil, still deserve love. If someone you know is successful or happy, be happy for them and try to emulate them. Belief in objective truth is important. Once you let human emotions and attitudes dominate, like social justice with its belief in the ultimate arbitrating power of the subjective experiences of oppressed people, or religions that have gone astray which put the desires of groups above moral good, you've got a problem. Instead, to fight envy, we need to believe in objective truth and good so as to not sink into the weaknesses inherent in human nature. On an individual basis, don't surrender anything to the envious. They will only envy you more. A great example is that oftentimes the most assimilated merchant middlemen groups like the Chinese in Indonesia or the Jews in Hungary or Germany have often been the most oppressed. Another example is with cancel culture, figures like Trump or Brett Kavanaugh, who, for all their faults, give no fucks, never get canceled while leftist figures that try to placate social justice get eaten alive. The key to getting away with envy as an individual lies with celebrities and aristocrats. These are people who are almost never envied since they're not comparable to normal people. If you're a wealthy person with a big house who's envied by all your middle-class neighbors, move to a yacht off the coast of France and you'll mentally be beyond envy of your local community. If you act like your status is exclusive and innate, others will not feel judged as they won't feel like they could be you. The other way is to be nondescript with wealth, living like Asians have, keeping all of your wealth on the interior. None of this is fail-safe, however. To end on a depressing note, just look at the Jews who have tried every single trick in order to not be oppressed, and it's still kept on happening. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Instagram, Twitter, or my Patreon where I've got the first couple hundred pages of my history of the world and cultural history of America written. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.